Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I know it's a busy time of year. A lot of folks are out in the field. A lot of producers are very busy with irrigating and various things like that. My name is Brendan Bopel. I'm the Director of Additive Conservation at the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust. CCLT was founded by the members of the Colorado Cattlemen's Association in 1995. And in the 28 years since, we have conserved over 750,000 acres of working lands across Colorado through voluntary conservation easement transactions. We are incredibly grateful for the close relationship that we share with agricultural producers and working landowners all over the state, and truly believe that producers are critical stewards of Colorado's natural resources, and especially our grasslands in the eastern portion of the state. And as you'll hear today, these grasslands are host a rich amount of biodiversity and possess important qualities that will help us address the current sort of challenges around agriculture and environment in our state. So conservation easements continue to be our main tool here at the Land Trust. We developed our additive conservation program just in the past few years. The program is meant to support landowners on our existing conservation easements through projects to support operational resiliency and hopefully enhance conservation values that were protected by those conservation easements. As part of that program, we've been developing an internal source of funding, which we call our Agricultural Resiliency Fund. It is meant to be very landowner friendly. Our hope is that it'll be leveraged with other forms of private and public funding, whether that be landowner match, NRCS EQIP, Fish and Wildlife Partners Program funding. And under that program, one of our priorities is grassland health and grazing efficiency. So I think much of what you'll hear today will be particularly relevant to that funding source and to our additive conservation program. Just two other quick notes. We were also fortunate to receive a grant from NIFWIF and the Department of Interior for the restoration and enhancement of grasslands in the eastern portion of the state. So more resources for these types of projects. Additionally, we recently became a eligible entity under the Colorado Department of Agriculture's STAR Plus program, which works with producers to provide financial assistance and incentives to increase and enhance soil health on working lands all over the state. We'll be enrolling producers in that program later this year, so I would strongly encourage you to get in touch. In general, if you are perhaps a landowner of a CCLT conservation easement, or you are a conservation partner interested in working with landowners on CCLT conservation easements, I would strongly encourage you to get in touch, both around the Agricultural Resiliency Fund, as well as the Additive Conservation Program in general. And just perfect segue, we truly believe that partnerships are crucial in this work. There is so much great work going on all over Colorado. And CCLT by no means wants to be duplicative or redundant. And we really want to lean on those partnerships, much like the partnership that we've been developing with the Xerces Society around the presentation today. So again, please get in touch around additive conservation or any of the funding opportunities we might have available that's related to this very important work on grasslands in Colorado. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ray Powers and just say, so grateful for the collaboration and all the work that they've put into this presentation, and to Xerces staff in general. It's just been a great partnership thus far, and hopefully this is just a kind of emblematic of what's to come. So Ray, I will turn it over to you. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, we're really excited to be here today and excited to work with the Land Trust. So let's get into it. You are getting a double Ray presentation today. I am Ray Powers. Ray Moranz and I are on the Rangeland team within the Xerces Society, and I'll talk a little bit more about the Rangeland team in just a little bit. I am Nebraska born and raised. My background is mainly in plant ecology, plant communities, and how soils and management impact those plant communities. mostly in mixed grass prairies, but also delving into short grass and tall grass prairies. So really a grasslands and a Great Plains prairie girl. And I'm going to let Ray go ahead and introduce himself and his background.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am a butterfly ecologist and plant ecologist by training, and I've been living in Oklahoma for the last 20 years, and I've done a lot of research on the effects of grazing and fire on pollinators and the plants that pollinators depend on. And my work covers supposedly the whole central US, but I got coworkers up north who pretty much have the northern plains all taken care of. I do get around. I travel a lot and get to see a lot of parts of the country, and I love that very much. I look forward to chatting about this topic with you today. Ray?
Awesome. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our additional Rangeland team members, Sarah Hamilton Buxton, who's based in Bismarck, North Dakota, and Jennifer Hopwood, who's in Omaha, Nebraska. And then way out in California, we have Dee Dee Soto, and they've all been pivotal in helping us with this work. So they're certainly a part of this, important part of this work for Xerces. And we'll see if we can get our slides to progress. There we go. So if you don't know the Xerces Society, we are a nonprofit organization and we focus on invertebrate conservation. So things without spines. A lot of our work is on insects, but we do a broad variety of invertebrate work. It's an odd name and I get asked about it a lot. Our founder, Robert Michael Pyle, named us the Xerces Society after a small blue butterfly whose habitat was the sandy hills of what is now San Francisco. So one of the first pollinator species to go extinct due to man-made causes. So Robert named this organization the Xerces Society in the hopes that we would, prevent that from happening ever again for our pollinators. And we do a broad variety of work. We do a lot of on-the-ground conservation, both in our partnership with federal agencies and through supply chain work. We do advocacy for policy. We do on-the-ground research as well. And we do a lot of community science, outreach, and education. Just a few of the things that the Xerces Society does. Ray Moranz and I are both partner biologists with the Natural Resources Conservation Services. So hopefully if you're a producer, you've heard of NRCS and are aware of the services they provide. Xerces is a partner organization with NRCS. We live in their field offices or their state offices, not live, work, and help with things that are generally diverse plantings that are dealing with pollinator and other wildlife plantings. So we can help with grazing applications, farming applications, a wide variety of things. Many of us also work kind of at a higher level within NRCS at the state or regional level, like Ray Moranz. So we're helping guide sort of technical documents and guidance for those programs and how plantings happen on the ground. And we are growing. I think we are about 80 staff strong now, and we've got a decent spread of folks across the United States. We do have 2 folks in Colorado. Steve will be your habitat person in Colorado. He is not a partner position with NRCS, but I believe with the city of Boulder. And so if you're thinking about doing habitat in Colorado, Steve Armstead would be a wonderful contact for you. And his email is on our website, and it's just steve.armstead@xerces.org. So huge props to Steve. He's great. And just like Brendan mentioned, I don't think any of us do this in isolation. We are a member-based organization, so we love our members. They're incredible. We really appreciate our members. And then we do all the same things that a lot of nonprofits do with grant funding and working with universities, working with those federal and state agencies for habitat projects. So this is just a huge thank you to everyone we work with that keeps us exciting work going and keeps us happy. I always appreciate a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going in a presentation. So you're going to have this Ray for a little bit longer, and I'll talk really briefly about pollinator habitat. Then we'll dive into the depths of depression with rangeland loss and kind of threats or status of rangeland loss. Then I'll hand it off to Ray Moranz, and he'll highlight some rangeland pollinators, go through some recommended practices for pollinators on rangelands, and then he'll pass it back to me. And I'm going to highlight some pollinator plants that are found on rangelands and their value for livestock. And we'll wrap it up with some resources and hopefully have plenty of time for questions. All right, so I'm going to take you back to second grade, third grade. I'm not sure when you learn about pollination, but what is a pollinator? Just a quick reminder. Really, it's anything that's moving. Those gametes of the plant from plant to plant, so pollen to the female stigma. Where we are, that's primarily going to be insects. So, I say insects like it's one thing, but it's actually a really broad group of insects that are pollinators. Butterflies and moths are some that people think of really easily when they think about pollinators. Flies, beetles, and wasps, maybe not so much, but at least flies and wasps are critically important for pollination and very important pollinators. And then, of course, our beloved bees, which are our most efficient and effective pollinators. They're hairy, they're feeding pollen to their young, they're moving it around. As we move into more subtropical and tropical habitat, pollinators today, we're really talking about insects. And I want to highlight and go through the life cycle of a solitary bee really quickly. When I say bee, like 90% of the world thinks of a honeybee. Honeybees are non-native species. They are a perennial hive, so they overwinter. The vast majority of our bees are solitary. So it's an individual female bee making a nest and reproducing. We do have a few social bees, but honeybees are unique, this unique system. So I just want to reframe what we're talking about when we're thinking about a bee. So when we think about a native bee and that lifestyle that's flying around, that's what you and I think about. That's probably only a few weeks of a native bee's life cycle. So the female bee is out and about, she's collecting pollen, and she is digging a nest. For most of our native bees, they're nesting underground. So she's digging out a nest and she's creating that pollen ball, which is a mix of pollen and nectar that she puts in that nest site. She then lays an egg on the pollen ball and goes and does that all again, makes another nest, makes a pollen ball, lays an egg. And she does that throughout her entire short life cycle as an adult. That egg hatches and becomes a larva, as you can see in the bottom photo. It eats that pollen ball for resources and grows. It then pupates and turns into what we think of as a bee, sort of that winged creature that's flying around. And that's happening through the dormant season. And when temperatures and light are right, that bee species will emerge from the ground to repeat the process. So those males and females are just alive for a short period and doing all this work in that little span of time. There's a huge diversity of bees, and they emerge throughout the entire season. So some are really early, some are mid, some are later. So anytime in that growing season, you're going to have bees around. The other portion of our bees nest inside of stems. So hollow or pithy stems that are out on the landscape, they'll be laying their eggs inside of that stem. So for bees, those are sort of the two overwintering or nesting sites that we need to think about. This life cycle is also pretty representative for wasps, as far as, wasps are mostly solitary and the adults are typically out for a short period of time. Those hornets, those social wasps, those are native, but they are a really small proportion of our wasp diversity. So that is a brief update on the life cycle of many, many of our native bees. And when we're talking about pollinators, we really need to talk about 3 habitat requirements for all of our pollinators. The first being a refuge from pesticides. So they need places where they're not going to be poisoned. I think that makes sense to everybody. They also need shelter. So they need those nest sites, that larval habitat, and that overwintering habitat. So for our moths and butterflies, that larval habitat is plants when they're eating those plants as they're growing, like the monarch butterfly on the milkweed shown here. And finally, we need those food resources. So having really diverse native vegetation throughout the season for nectar and pollen resources for our pollinators is critically important. And again, for those larval stages, we need those larval food sources. And rangelands are critically important habitat for pollinators. I think there's been a really heavy focus on cropland and farmland pollinator habitat, which we need, right? We need all hands on deck for our wildlife habitat. But I think rangelands have been undervalued as a habitat for pollinators. They are typically landscapes that have much less pesticide application than our row crop agriculture, which in itself is valuable. But they are also providing all three of those habitat needs beyond the pesticide-free zone. They've got healthy rangelands have really diverse plant communities that are providing those pollen and nectar resources. They likely have areas of bare ground and different soil types for our ground nesting bees and other ground nesting pollinators to nest and overwinter. They provide those plants with stems and have standing plant material through the winter. So our stem nesting bees and other stem nesting pollinators can reproduce. And they have larval host plants for our moths and butterflies that rely on those plant species. So rangelands are really knockout habitat for our pollinators. And we at Xerces recognize that ranchers are really vital conservation partners. There's a lot of pressures on our native grasslands, such as converting to row crop ag or gas production, and maintaining these areas as native grass and native plant communities is vitally important for all of us. So we know that rangeland took up most of the Great Plains. All of the tan areas on this map were extant rangeland pre-colonial times. So you can see much of eastern Colorado as well as extreme West Colorado was considered grassland. This is from 2007, a map from the Forest Service. And the brown is our extant private rangeland. And that kind of yellowish tan color is our extant public rangeland. So you can see that a lot of our areas of rangeland and grassland have been lost through time. You can also see here that that divide of private rangeland in the Great Plains to publicly owned rangelands in the West is very much a real thing. And you guys see that really right in the middle of Colorado, where you're switching over to public lands for much of your rangeland in Western Colorado. So we need to protect these places while we still can. This is a big snapshot of the World Wildlife Fund's 2022 plow print report. So the green here is extant rangeland or grassland. The brown is previously plowed. So those are acres that had been on previous plow reports. And then the red, which is a little bit hard to see this far zoomed out, are newly plowed or newly lost grassland acres. And this actually is coming from 2020 data. So they're just have a little bit of a lag when we're looking at land use and getting that data through time. And here's zoomed into Colorado. So although the rate of loss in 2020 was not greater than sort of the 5-year average, it still was a significant loss of grassland acres. I think it was 1.8 million acres in 2020. So we are still losing those native grasslands, which provide such a huge array of ecosystem services. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Ray Moranz with hopefully a more positive message.
Great. Oh, hey, everybody. Yeah, I want to talk a bit first about pollinator diversity in Colorado. And Ray mentioned earlier that the 6 main groups of insect pollinators, and shown here on your screen. Starting with the upper left, you've got butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, and bees. Oh, next slide, please. there are over 250 butterfly species in Colorado. That's pretty darn high for any US state. There are thousands of species of moths, and most of those are pollinators. But really amazingly to me, 946 different species of native bees in Colorado. That is a huge number. It's probably going to grow, but that is a colossal number as it is. It's going to grow because the scientists are going to discover a few more in time. Really, really cool. All of those bees have an important role in pollinating wildflowers, but also crops within Colorado. Next slide, please. I want to talk a bit now about rare pollinators. Some of these butterflies and bees and moths and other critters, people are worried about. They're not doing well. One of the more famous ones, I learned about this one years ago, never had the pleasure to see it, the Uncompahgre fritillary. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Beloria acrocnema. This is a butterfly that was discovered, I think, only about 50 years ago in the Rockies, in a fairly small area. Also, they found it in the San Juans. And this is not an abundant butterfly. This butterfly is on the endangered species list and listed as endangered. So this is one that is just hanging on. Next slide, please. A rare butterfly in Colorado that I have seen is the Iowa skipper. Now you might think with a name like Iowa skipper, these are in Iowa and nowhere else. Well, actually, they're not in Iowa anymore. They've disappeared completely from the state of Iowa. They've disappeared, I think, completely from Minnesota and numerous other states in the central US. I think they're just barely hanging on in Colorado. Oddly enough, the place where they're doing the best is where I live, Oklahoma. So I actually have these on my farm in northern Oklahoma. But this butterfly is doing so badly, next slide, doing so badly that one organization, the Center for Food Safety, has asked the federal government to list this little butterfly as an endangered species. I don't know if it's rare enough to merit that. That's up to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at this point to figure that out. But another rare butterfly in Colorado. Next slide, please. This is one of the rarest butterflies of Colorado, the eastern half of the state, the regal fritillary. I know a lot about this one. I studied this one for my PhD. It's a big, flashy, gorgeous species that's totally dependent on grassland. It lays its eggs on violets. So it needs grasslands with violets, and the adults need a lot of nectar. So they need a lot of flowers to feed upon. Again, this is in the eastern half of Colorado in the grasslands. Very rare, also being considered for the Endangered Species Act listing. Next slide. Oh, regal fritillaries, as I mentioned a moment ago, are grassland specialists. I forgot I had some photos of where they might live. The photo on the left is some Oklahoma grassland. The photo on the right is Colorado grassland, where you could expect to find regals. Next slide. This is probably the most famous butterfly species in the world, the monarch. And I meet many, many people who say, you know, when I was a kid, this butterfly was a lot more abundant than it is now. And because of that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is thinking about listing this as a threatened species sometime this winter. I got word this week that it seems like it's likely to be the case, that this will be listed as a threatened species because the population, as measured by the massive colonies in Mexico each winter, the population has plummeted. Next slide. I also want to talk about rare bees in Colorado. Remember how I mentioned there are 946 bee species? Well, most of those bee species, we don't have good idea of how many there are. There are not enough researchers to study them to figure out if they're rare or not. But the bumblebees are so big and easy to identify that we have a good handle on what's happening with the bumblebees. And there are 6 bumblebees listed by the state of Colorado as species of concern. And there you see the list of these species. The ones you're most likely to see are the first 3. Bombus fraternus, Bombus morrisoni, and Bombus pennsylvanicus. Now, those are all the fancy names. I know them as. On the left, of course, you've got the common names. And next slide, we'll show you some pictures of some of these bees. The American bumblebee, the queen at least, shown on the left, is big and flashy, very brightly colored when she comes out from underground early in the spring. And if you look at the thorax, which is the region between the head and the abdomen, the thorax is yellow in the front and black below. So it's yellow and black thorax. Over on the right, we have a male American bumblebee in the fall. Next slide, please. Southern Plains bumblebee, for me, is one of the ones I'm most excited about seeing, because I've still only seen 4 of them in my life. Oddly enough, even though it's called the Southern Plains bumblebee, I've never seen it in the Southern Plains. I've seen them in Arkansas, Florida, and Nebraska. But you still have these in Colorado. Big flashy queen bee shown on the left. And note the thorax, again, the region just behind the head. In this case, it's yellow, black, yellow. The previous bee was yellow and black. This one's yellow, black, yellow. This gives you an idea of how we learn how to distinguish one bumblebee for another. It's not super complicated. It's not easy, but it's not rocket science. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the rarest bumblebees. This is certainly one of the rarest bumblebees in North America. How rare is it? Almost no one has seen one in decades. The variable cuckoo bumblebee. Very, very few records of this bee in the last 50 years. Next slide. So now I'm going to switch to talk about how we manage rangeland to help pollinators. Next slide, please. One thing we really need to be cautious about with pollinator habitat is overgrazing. By overgrazing, I mean grazing very heavily for month after month after month, year after year after year. Chronic overgrazing. That is a big problem for a lot of our natural resources, and it's certainly a big problem for bees, butterflies, and other pollinators. The main risks of the overgrazing that are fairly direct to the pollinators are that the stems that stem nesting bees would nest in get trampled or eaten by the livestock, or all the hoof action caused by chronic overgrazing can compact the soil, make it difficult for ground nesting bees to get underground and make their nests. The third thing listed here is really, really important to all of our pollinators, whether they're bees, butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, etc. There's a big chance with chronic overgrazing that our great, delicious nectar sources and pollen sources get eaten up by the livestock, because as Ray will talk about later, a lot of these wildflowers are quite tasty to livestock. Next slide, please. Another aspect of chronic overutilization, which you already know about, is soil erosion. This is a ranch in Texas. Next slide, please. This is a ranch in the same county, and you can see that there are no flowers here. The grass is about 2 inches tall. And this is what this place looks like year after year after year. So this is not going to be much habitat at all for pollinators. Next slide, please. But also look what's happening due to that severe overgrazing. You can see on the slope of this hill, lots of erosion, lots of rills and gullies forming that are going to be eroding for years to come, making those gullies even deeper, taking away the soil, making it even harder for the livestock to graze. Next slide, please. So the solution that we at Xerces and NRCS are fond of is prescribed grazing. Grazing in a manner that's both good for the cattle operator or the livestock operator, but also good for the various natural resources we want to protect, including pollinators. So some specific tips are to use stocking rates that balance cattle performance or livestock performance and rangeland health with the abundance of wildflowers and diversity. Now, I'm not saying that every ranch should look have as many flowers as the one in the picture, but we got to have some flowers out there if we want to have some pollinators. Secondly, of course, we want to avoid chronic overutilization. That's extremely important. Really intense periods, really intense grazing for short periods can be really great. A really great management practice for a whole bunch of wildlife species, including pollinators. As long as you're, after an intense period of grazing, you provide long periods of rest that give a chance for the wildflowers and the grasses time to recover. Next slide, please. We also recommend that you try to change the season of use. And this is a basic tenet of grazing management for the plant community as well as the pollinators. Because if you graze land at the same time every year, that's getting rid of the livestock are focusing on eating certain plants, the plants that are out at that time of year. It can hurt those plants while helping the plants that they're not grazing at other times of year. So it's a good idea to mix it up. Try to mix a given plot of land in the spring and then move them to a different plot of land in the summer and do another plot of land in the fall, if you can do it. And then the next year, that plot of land that you graze in the spring, graze that plot in the summer. Mix it up. And that will help the plant community stay resilient, the entire plant community, the spring flowers, the summer flowers, the fall flowers, they'll help them all stay out there on the landscape. It's also important to monitor the effects of grazing on your grass, but also on your wildflowers. Next slide. Benefits of prescribed grazing: it helps you maintain healthy grass for your livestock, provides diversity of habitat for pollinators, and it promotes native wildflower diversity, which of course is important for pollinators, but as Ray is going to point out, very important for livestock, given that many livestock eat wildflowers. Next slide, please. A growing threat in the central US is woody plant encroachment. This happens to be a photo from my farm in Oklahoma showing what used to be prairie, what used to be grassland that was full of forage for cattle. When this photo was taken, this was a forest of juniper, a major problem. Next slide, please. Underneath those junipers, this is what it looks like. Heavy, heavy shade, nothing, no grasses, no wildflowers, nothing for pollinators, and nothing for livestock for that matter, nothing for cattle. This is a bit of a wasteland. Few birds live in there, but not many bird species even. Next slide, please. Woody plant encroachment is a growing threat, especially in the eastern half of the plains. We can see in this map, there's a little bit of red in Colorado. There are some areas just east of the Front Range that are experiencing some of this juniper encroachment on our grasslands, and that's something we need to fight. Next slide, please. The USDA NRCS helps landowners pay to mechanically remove various juniper species that are encroaching on grasslands. I took these photos at a ranch in southern Oklahoma. On the left, you see a bulldozer knocking down trees. Yes, that's a management strategy because that rancher has a lot fewer cattle than he used to because cattle can't eat junipers. So they knocked them down. You had a lot on the right, you see a lot of dead junipers. Eventually, they lit a prescribed burn and they burned those up, and that became phenomenal pollinator habitat, but also great for the livestock as well. Next slide, please. So prescribed fire can be a useful tool. Now, I live in an area where we have a very strong fire culture. And I know that most of Colorado does not have that same kind of fire culture. By fire culture, I mean, in my neck of the woods, people have been burning decade after decade. The Native Americans were doing it. And then when the European Americans got to Oklahoma, they continued that practice. I do know that it's not as where you go in the country. Fire doesn't always do the same thing, and it's not equally safe everywhere, but it can be a useful tool in some parts of Colorado, we believe. Next slide, please. I do want to let you know that prescribed fire can harm pollinators. The direct effects of it, fire can kill them. You know, if there's a caterpillar out there in your rangeland and you in February and you light a fire, good chance you're going to fry it. That happens. Eggs, larvae, pupae, the immobile forms, they get burned up sometimes. Of course, the bees nesting underground, they're just fine. They're protected from the fire. Indirect effects of fire. If you do a burn during the growing season, you can temporarily remove flowers and nesting habitat. Next slide. This is a photo of fire on our rangeland on my property in Oklahoma. So even though I know that fire can hurt pollinators, I still do it. I am paid to do this. I am paid by the USDA to burn on my land to help pollinators, which is pretty cool because I'm getting rid of those cedars, opening things up for the wildflowers and making better habitat for the bees and the butterflies. Next slide. So the benefits of prescribed burning. Fire helps our grasslands stay grasslands. They help keep out the woody invaders in our area, in our neck of the woods, eastern red cedar. Fire increases the bare ground for seed germination, and it increases the blooming of multiple wildflower species. It really does this big time. Next slide, please. So here are some photos that I took for my PhD research showing that prescribed fire was greatly increasing the bloom of pale purple coneflower on the left and tall blazing star on the right. And what I should also have here are photos of the areas that didn't get burned. And what you would see is a lot of grass, primarily brownish looking grass, and not nearly as many flowers, almost no flowers. So it can have an amazing stimulatory effect on flower production. And these sites had huge numbers of pollinators, including rare regal fritillary butterflies and monarchs. Next slide, please. So if you burn, we have some BMPs, some best management practices. Try not to burn more than 1/3 of your property in a given year, because we don't want the whole thing to burn, because you might wipe out a population of insect. Sure, if it's a butterfly and it's got that caterpillar, those caterpillars that are out in your grass in February, you burn the whole thing, you might wipe out the whole population. If on the other hand, you burn 1/5 of your land or 1/4 or 1/3, you'll kill a few that year, but you'll improve the habitat, and that habitat will get recolonized by the area that you didn't burn. And I'm going to skip to that last item there, which is rotate the season of burn. Just like with grazing, it can be good to graze your land at different times of the year. It's good to rotate the season of burn. Don't burn always at the same time. It's better to mix it up. Next slide, please. Also, if you have grasslands that are really, really heavily grass dominated with very few wildflowers, you can increase the number of wildflowers by interseeding, obtaining native wildflower seed and putting it out there. But it's key, and we have publications, detailed publications on how to do this. You got to open it up things first to provide some bare ground for the seed. So a good thing to do might be to do a burn or do some mowing, or after a period of intense grazing, that's when you're going to put out some wildflower seed. Okay, Ray, is it time to switch off?
I think so.
I think so too. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thanks so much, Ray. All right, I'm gonna wrap up the management section with a couple of non-pollinator management recommendations, but still invertebrates. I don't know anyone who doesn't love dung beetles. They are such cool little organisms, and really, assist a rancher in plant production and moving nutrients around and breaking down dung, opening up space for forage to grow. So So any rancher I've worked with is excited about dung beetles and a fan of dung beetles. However, one management action that many ranchers take can really severely impact dung beetle populations, and that's porons for internal worm control and some fly control. And so we really recommend, if possible, that you avoid porons that end in dectin or mectin. So things like ivermectin and cydectin. If you can go and look at the active ingredient list of your endecticide, which is killing those internal parasites. The dectins and mectins tend to be really detrimental to our dung beetle populations. So when we can avoid those type of porons, we highly recommend it. Some research has found that adult dung beetles are actually attracted to dung with those treatment products in them. However, the larval stage can't survive in those treated dung piles. So it's actually having an even more increased effect on mortality of those dung beetle populations, because the adults, for some reason, are seen in higher levels on treated dung. So there are some products that you can use. They end in azole, A-Z-O-L-E. Those tend to not have impacts on our dung beetle populations. But first of all, we would recommend that you use IPM strategies for internal parasite management. This can be things like rotating pasture, idling a pasture for a year if it was an area of really bad breakout in a previous year. As well as using injectables or other products that are less harmful to our beloved dung beetles. Just also really want to briefly touch on grasshoppers populations and grasshopper spraying. So spraying for grasshoppers is a really common strategy, more typically on public rangelands of the West. There are annual sprays conducted by APHIS on just huge areas of our public rangeland to try to control grasshopper populations on those rangelands. However, most of these grasshoppers aren't pests, and they're not often doing sort of a threshold where they're looking at the number of grasshopper populations and then spraying in reaction to those grasshopper populations. That's more prophylactic. Additionally, having a robust insect community can help control those grasshopper populations. And those populations just vary a lot through time, regardless of spraying or not spraying. They're also critically important food sources for many of our grassland birds, which we know are not doing so great. Orthoptera or grasshoppers are one of the top food sources for young grassland birds. So we want to keep them on the landscape. Additionally, these are insecticides that they're spraying. So our bees, our butterflies, our moths, they're all impacted by these sprays. So they're really wiping out a huge diversity of organisms. So I know some years it's crazy. You walk through a rangeland and you're just getting pummeled with grasshoppers. And as a producer, that would be very stressful to feel like, your forage is being just consumed by an invertebrate. But there's often a really large number of grasshopper and marmot cricket populations that we know the landscape can support with no economic impact to your cattle production. So kind of knowing where those thresholds are for your piece of property and monitoring to see if you actually need to spray is definitely something that we would recommend. And when you have reached that kind of threshold of like, I need to do something about this, using the lowest effective application rate and just treating places of concern and not your entire property. Many of those insecticides also travel freely through water. So making sure we're using really large buffers around water sources when we're thinking about grasshopper sprays. I think that is it for kind of rangeland management tips that we wanted to share. We've got a little bit of time, so I'm going to talk about a rangeland team project that we've been doing for the last few years that has been really exciting. So a lot of those management recommendations that Ray Moranz went through were part of a document that we put out, Rangeland Management for Pollinators in the Great Plains. while researching and creating that document, we really thought, what would be really a useful piece of information to communicate to ranchers is what those wildflowers provide for their livestock. We know cattle and bison and sheep and goats are eating these flowers. And there's really extensive publications and research done on what forage quality of grasses are, and to a certain extent, the mineral content of our different grasses, both native and non. And so we thought, all right, let's go get that information and add it to this document. And we were pretty surprised to find that a really comprehensive set of data on what wildflowers provide for livestock, it just doesn't exist. There's little pockets of it here and there, but nothing comprehensive. And for the vast majority of species, there is no information. You'll see some qualitative palatability and or forage quality ratings, but there almost never is a citation or research to show, why that is considered highly palatable or a high value forage. And we thought this was a really critically important piece of information because some ranchers, particularly in the southern plains, really view wildflowers as competition to their grasses. They might think they're noxious weeds. They think they're taking up water that their grasses could use, that they're taking up space that they could get more grass forage. And there are widespread broadcast herbicide sprays for broadleaf plants on grasslands on, thousands, probably millions of acres of rangeland in the Great Plains. So kind of breaking that idea that these plants are competition or taking up space or something that is going to poison your cattle was something we really, really wanted to do. So we worked with rangeland experts throughout the region to identify rangeland plants that were abundant and common. We used our own expertise to identify those that are valuable for pollinators because we wanted that component as well. And also those which we think cattle are eating. We didn't want to go out and spend money analyzing plants that we know cattle aren't eating, so they're likely not providing resources. And we went out and collected samples of these plants in 2021 and 2022. And we tested their forage quality and a whole suite of minerals of these wildflower species. We did a pretty rigorous and structured sampling in 2021. We just had a short species list, but we were kind of sampling across regionality within states and across states because we had no idea how much these would vary and what impacted forage quality or mineral levels in these plants. And so we were primarily in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska in 2021. Our 2021 results showed us that it didn't seem like region, east to west or north to south, mattered a huge amount. And after kind of consulting with our range experts, we decided going after just a lot more species, a lot more variability to try to even get a baseline data set for these wildflowers was the way to go for 2022. And we're lucky to have some funding. So we added 60 more species. So we've got about 74 or 75 wildflower species covered. In total, we had about 700 samples between the 2 years, and it's across 10 states. So we added some of those buffer states around the central Great Plains states in 2022. Here's just a quick shot of our sampling effort and where we collected samples. So Steve did collect for us in Colorado in 2022. Ray Moranz collected in Oklahoma. Thank you, Ray. And we've got heavy areas of collection in North Dakota, and Nebraska and Montana. This was done in partnership with other nonprofits, a lot of NRCS field staff, some plant material center staff, just a huge number of people jumped onto this effort, and we so appreciate them. Okay, this slide is a lot, and you don't need to take in all of these plants or even look at any of them. So this is all of the plant species that we collected over the 2 years. These bars are representing the total digestible nutrients. So sort of, this is a big shot picture of what these plants are providing for cattle. And then the colors represent sort of excellent range of TDN or total digestible nutrients. Good is yellow, and then sort of medium, average quality forage is gray. So 93% of our species were at or above minimum requirements for TDN for a 1,200 pound lactating cow. And many of them were performing at really excellent levels. So most of them are exceeding the TDN levels that we see in just strictly grass hay. And some of them are kind of edging into that alfalfa hay level of nutrients provided for livestock. So pretty surprising. We knew a lot of these, legumes we really expected to be rock stars, but there were definitely some species that we didn't anticipate performing so well that did. And we didn't expect TDN to be so high. My understanding from some of our experts was that crude protein, they kind of assumed crude protein for our wildflowers was pretty high, but that TDN, those total digestible nutrients, so that fiber component really was knocking back the crude protein. But that's not the case. Some of this data will be available probably early next year in some wildflower guides for the Northern Plains and the Central Great Plains. And it will include, some pieces of this data. We have funding to continue this work in North Dakota in 2024. We are actively pursuing funding in Nebraska and South Dakota to keep doing this work. And we're also looking for additional partnerships to keep this momentum going. All right, so I'm going to highlight 10 plant species that we collected. Some of them we collected in Colorado that are found in Colorado and are great pollinator plants and found on rangelands. I'm going to start with lead plant. I'm just going to get you oriented here. So I have these presence absence maps. These are coming from USDA plants database. So looks like it's mostly eastern. I would be surprised if it wasn't found in more counties in Colorado, but I haven't spent a whole lot of time in Colorado. On every slide, I'll have the county presence absence maps. I've also put the crude protein for each of these species onto these slides. I've also included the crude protein levels for a warm season grass, which is little blue stem that you see in the red, and a cool season grass, which is needle and thread, which is the blue line. And so these measures are across sort of the growth stage of both the grasses and the flowers. So vegetative stage, this is not the same date for all of these. This is kind of a different date for each of these, but it's when that plant is in the vegetative state before it's put up a flowering seed head. Pre-flowering is when we started to see a bud. So there's evidence or a flowering stalk. Flowering is an open flower, whatever stage, it could be pretty late, and then seed set when those seeds start to form. So you can see that lead plants performing, above both of our grasses, both of our native grasses, in those sort of upper teen levels for crude protein, which is excellent levels for crude protein. We know this is a plant that cattle really like. It's also really attractive for pollinators. It's got awesome sort of neon orange pollen, and it's a larval host for multiple moss species. So a very deep-rooted species. Moving on to yarrow. This is in the aster family. The county presence is in orange because it's a plant species that's also found internationally, so it's both native to the continent and other places. So it's got orange instead of green for its county presence. Central and west here in Colorado. Pull this down real quick. We didn't collect it in that vegetative or pre-flowering stage, just in the flowering and seed set stage. This is a plant that I see planted a lot in pollinator plantings because it's an earlier blooming species. That's something we use a lot in programs to account for that early season pollinating species. I see a lot of flies on this one, flies and wasps. It just had a fern-like leaves, almost looks like a chrysanthemum. So hopefully some of you have seen yarrow or are familiar with this one. Showy milkweed. We sampled, gosh, I can't remember if it was 5 or 6 milkweed species, and over again, they were rock stars in terms of TDN and crude protein. There's also some new research out of Nebraska that shows that some milkweed species like showy milkweed and common milkweed are highly preferred by cattle. These are plants that they are actively seeking out, even in really dense vegetated areas. They're going right for these milkweeds. So milkweeds have long been assumed to be toxic to livestock because of that milky sap. However, they really vary in their level of toxicity. So as we move into the western region of the United States, many of the more western species have higher levels of that toxic component. But a lot of our Great Plains species are pretty low toxicity and in fact, really eaten by cattle and preferred by cattle. Additionally, this is, one of our monarch nectar plants and our monarch host plant for those monarch caterpillars. And it's just all the milkweeds are just awesome rock star pollinator plant species. Heath aster is another common rangeland species. We only collected this in the pre-flowering stage, and I believe Steve got this one in Colorado. So it's not cutting out really high for crude protein. One thing I'll say about heath aster is it's like tough as nails plant. This plant will show up after a year of drought, when everything is dry and dead. Heath aster is just living its best life. So, it may not be a really rock star plant in regular years for forage, but it might be something that's important in some of those years that, everything else is not doing very well. Purple prairie clover is another one of those legumes. Mostly over here in the eastern portion of Colorado, it looks like. And again, kind of in the legume family, we're expecting pretty high crude protein levels, and that's what we're seeing. This is a great plant for bees and butterflies. And I believe it has a bee species that relies on its specific pollen that can only use purple prairie clover pollen to feed its young. So I believe it has at least one of those species.
Yes, it does.
Okay, thanks, Ray. American licorice, again in the legume family, but like, look at those crude protein numbers. We're in the 20s for crude protein percentage for this plant in the vegetative, and it's, maintaining that even high teen levels through flowering, which is just wild to me. This is another plant that's really deep rooted and can do pretty well in years of drought. It's got a fairly early bloom period, starts pretty early, so that's nice to see. I can't remember if this root is sweet or not, but so licorice that you ate, the sweet component comes from glycyrrhizic acid, and this is Glycyrrhiza lepidota. I've never eaten this root, but it was used by Native Americans for medicinal reasons. But I would love to take a bite and see if it's sweet at all. All right, common sunflower. So sunflowers are native to North America. The ones used in productions are varieties of our native species. This is one that I was surprised at the crude protein levels. I wouldn't have assumed, in the aster family, kind of a rough, it's an annual plant, just not something I was expecting at all. And it's still showing up pretty good for those crude protein levels. This is just an absolute favorite of many bees and really important in that late period of bloom. It can have really a profusion of blooms, many common sunflowers across the landscape. So that can be really important for our pollinators. Oh, 10-petal blazing star. This plant is gorgeous. This is a night blooming species within the laurel family, which is a little different. I think we only have 50 or 60 native species to North America in that family. It likes these sort of really pretty rocky, rugged locations for growth. So it might be something that your cattle are munching on when they're up on those hilltops. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. It's just beautiful. We are rounded in the corner here. We're almost to the end. Retibita columnifera, or upright prairie coneflower. This is another one in the aster family. This is another one that I think of as sort of a workhouse pollinator species that gets planted in a lot of pollinator plantings. It does establish fairly readily. It does fade through time. It kind of likes that disturbance, and it kind of thrives on having that disturbance through time. Peaking with that crude protein in the pre-flowering stage at about 15%, which is commendable. Scarlet globe mallow. This is probably the most unique flower color that I see in the Great Plains. I can't think of anything else that has that kind of salmony pink orange flower color. So I think this is a gorgeous plant. It's in the mallow family. and really high levels of crude protein at the pre-flowering stage. This is one that when we talk to rangeland experts again and again, they mention this species as something that cattle are feeding on, especially early in the plant season. So this is probably something that's pretty important on those more western rangelands when you turn out pretty early. This is important for a lot of different pollinators. This species can accumulate selenium. So if you're in high selenium soils, it might be something to be aware of. I think that was 10 awesome pollinator plants where hopefully you guys have seen some of those or all of those if you own rangeland. Just briefly want to talk on NRCS programs for rangeland. And this is a really high level shot of different programs that you could think about and look at. So Grassland CRP, which stands for the Conservation Reserve Program. Regular CRP is sort of taking land out of production. Grassland CRP is unique in that you can enroll acres and continue to use managed grazing on those acres. So really is a working lands program. EQIP, or the Environmental Qualities Incentive Program, has a variety of practices that you can use for prescribed grazing and range planting. In addition to those that I've listed, there's also assistance for things like interior fencing, water pipe, all kinds of things that can help diversify your grazing operation. The Conservation Stewardship Program kind of enrolls the entire ranch, and then you do a variety of enhancements. And there's just a huge number of enhancements that you can choose from. There is one specifically for dung beetles and porons, so reducing those porons. So you get a payment for eliminating poron use. There's grazing for wildlife species. There's some grazing for monarch in some states, just a wide variety of things. And I know we're going a bit over, but I'm going to pass it off last time to Ray to talk about resources and wrap up.
Thank you, Ray. I am going to just talk about a couple of these and skip a few. Next slide, please. I do want to let people know that we have books that we have published on pollinators and beneficial insects. They're pretty darn high quality books that my colleagues have written. So you can find those online. Next slide, please. We also have a lot of free resources on our website, xerces.org. Dozens and dozens, perhaps, well, actually, it's in the hundreds of documents we've written on how to protect, how to conserve pollinators and other invertebrates. Next slide. And I do want to let you know that we have a rangeland website, the Xerces Rangeland website. Next slide, please. And on that Xerces Rangeland page, we have sets of various resources like a video in which we talk about pollinator conservation. We have a pollinator assessment guide. We have some written documents as well. Next slide, please. And this is I think, our premier document for helping ranchers who want to help pollinators, this guide to rangeland management and pollinators for producers in the Great Plains. Many of the principles could be applied anywhere in Colorado. And this document focuses on the practice of grazing with also having some prescribed fire, brush and weed control, and interseeding. Next slide, please. This is a guide to help people monitor their rangeland and determine how many pollinators they have and what's the quality of habitat on their land. So this is an excellent tool. It's quite user-friendly. It's something that you could figure out yourself. I've taught people to use it in about 5 minutes. You could take it out on your, download it, take it out on your ranch this weekend, learn the baseline conditions, and then if you change your management practices, you can run this exercise again later to see if you detect any changes. Next slide, please. Let's pass through this one. Do need to mention that we have pollinator plant lists. Each of these lists has 50 great species for pollinators. Next slide. And want to point out that we have 4 different ones that cover Colorado. The one on the left is for Western Colorado. The one on the right is for the Rockies. Next slide. And then we have similar documents for the Northern Plains and the Southern Plains for Eastern Colorado. Next slide, please. We have a document, if you want to learn about the milkweeds and you're a big monarch fan, you can learn about milkweeds of Colorado, available for free at our website. Next slide. Go ahead and let's just skip this one for now, please. If you're worried about climate change, we have a document that can help you with that. Now, it's not going to solve all the world's problems. It's not talking about driving less or anything like that, how to solve the world's problems of climate change. Instead, it discusses how you can make your land more resilient to the effects of climate change, how you can help the pollinators withstand climate change on your land. Next slide, please. We, of course, can be connected with on social media. We encourage you to go to our Facebook page or Twitter or Instagram pages at Xerces Society. Next slide. And we want to acknowledge all of our supporters, numerous corporations and nonprofits and governmental agencies that provide support, but most importantly, our Xerces Society members. Next slide, please. So we would be quite honored if you joined the movement and became members of the Xerces Society. To do so, please go to the website xerces.org/donate to become members. Next slide. Okay, that is it for us. Let us know if you have any questions. These are our email addresses: rayann.powers@xerces.org, ray.moranz@xerces.org. And I think Ray, oh yes, I'm supposed to point out that we have poll questions for you. So Carly.
Go ahead and launch those now. And we'll give folks a few moments to answer those. I know we are going over on time, but we do have a question or two to be answered live as well if you're able to stick with us. But I'll give you a few moments to answer these poll questions here, and we can look at our answers. Okay, we've got a few people submit answers. I'm gonna give us just a few more moments in case anybody's trying to fill out the last one. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. And then do we want to share the results, or is that for our internal information?
I think we'll use it internally. Thank
Okay,
you.
great.
You stuck
thank you
around,
so much
everyone, to do the
for-
poll, and we can look at questions. It looks like we've got a couple.
Yeah, so the first one is from Tina. Ray, I know you talked about a lot of the benefits of prescribed fire, but she is wondering about, doesn't prescribed fire also at times get rid of predatory insects that affect or kill good pollinators? Oh,
And I'm happy to answer that. Yeah, I haven't seen any research actually about the effects of prescribed fire on predatory insects, but certainly some predatory insects are going to be killed by fire. Now, some of those predatory insects are eating pollinators, but some of those predatory insects are also eating bad bugs, you know, the insect pests that get on crops and on garden plants. So the basic bottom line is that for ecosystems where fire is part of the system, a natural part of the system, we do want to restore fire to those ecosystems, but like I mentioned earlier, don't burn do a prescribed burn on a whole property. Do a portion so that if you're harming any of the pollinators or any of the predatory insects, you're only harming a portion of the population. And of course, we are doing that in the hope that we're improving the habitat for the population as a whole. Okay, how about another one?
Awesome, thank you so much. And then the last two questions are more of asking for information. So I think Ray Powers had a slide up about total digestible nutrients, and there was a little reference to a hyperlink down there. And Tina was wondering if she follows that link, can she get that slide, or can it be sent to her if she contacts you?
Yeah, Tina, you can reach out. I can get you the slide right now. That analysis and visualization of that is pretty hot off the press. So probably the best thing beyond reaching out to me is keeping an eye on our Xerces Rangeland webpage. So when those resources are available, they will be posted there. But yeah, I'm happy to get you that just quick slide of TDN.